Let's take a look at Section 3, Module 1, Installed and Configuration. Prerequisites for installing the business intelligence features, we can see here in the first bullet point. We must be using a supported operating system. Since we're using SQL Server 2019, it requires the Windows Server 2016 or higher operating system. And you can see on the first bullet point the different versions of SQL Server as well as the required operating systems. We do need the .NET framework. I mentioned earlier that when you install Microsoft SQL Server, one of the things that it does, it'll inspect the version of the .NET framework that you have. If it doesn't find the appropriate framework, it can install it for you. You can always manually use a browser and do a search on the .NET framework, and you can download the latest .NET framework manually, install it manually, and then when you install Microsoft SQL Server, you'll see that it's already there. But in my experience, if I don't have what I need as far as the .NET framework is concerned, the installation of SQL Server will do it for me. In a few rare cases, I've had to manually stop the SQL Server install and manually go search for and download the most recent version of the .NET framework, manually download it and install it, and then reattempt the SQL Server installation. And I've always been successful if I've had to do that. If you're going to be using reporting services, we mentioned that reporting services is a separate download and install. But before you can actually configure reporting services, you're going to need an instance of the Microsoft SQL Server Relational Database Engine. So if you're installing SQL Server Reporting Services 2019 and you don't have an instance of the SQL Server Database Engine, go ahead and install the SQL Server 2019 Database Engine either on the same machine or on a different machine. If you already have a Microsoft SQL Server Relational Database Engine installed on the machine you want to install reporting services on, or on a machine that's connected to your network, and it's SQL Server 2005 or higher, then you're good to go. Reporting services and the Relational Database Engine don't have to be installed on the same physical machine. But the two databases, Report Server and Report Server TempDB, must be hosted on an instance of Microsoft SQL Server, the Relational Database Engine version 2005 or higher. Let's talk about service accounts. A service is an extension of the Windows operating system. A service is not the same as an application. Applications can only launch after a user's logged on. Excel is an example of an application. Word is an example of an application. You log on, then you can launch applications. Applications have both a graphical interface as well as an executable. Applications are limited to the permission structure and the security environment of the user that's logged on. Services, on the other hand, have an executable, but they have no graphical interface. Services are merely an extension of the Windows operating system. So there's an executable that needs to start up. But a service can be configured to start up automatically. And so if a service is going to start up automatically without any user interaction, it needs to know a user account and password to use so it can log on to the operating system. You as a human have to log on to the operating system. Services also have to log on to the operating system. So when a service is configured, we can configure the start mode to be automatic. If it's going to start up automatically without any interaction with a human, we must configure it with a user account and a password. You can use the built-in local system account or the network service account. You could also use the built-in system administrator account. What is highly recommended is to actually use an Active Directory account. Of course, this assumes that you're using an Active Directory environment. If you're not using an Active Directory account and you're simply installing SQL Server on a standalone Windows machine, you can go ahead and create your own local Windows user account, or you can use one of the built-in accounts like the local system account. The local system account has the same privileges as the built-in local administrator account. But I mentioned earlier, if you're installing SQL Server on a machine that's a member of an Active Directory domain, it would be best if you create a domain user account. If you don't have permissions to create domain user accounts, then simply ask your domain administrator to create a domain user account for you. Set a password, make sure the password never expires. And the reason you don't want the password to expire is because your domain will probably have password policies that cause your passwords to periodically expire. We want to use an account that's not used by a human. We don't want the password to expire, otherwise you're going to have to periodically reset the password on all of these services, and that can be a time-consuming process. So we can see the last bullet point here. It says best practice according to Microsoft is to use a domain user account and use a separate account for each business intelligence service. So a separate user account for the relational database engine, a separate account for analysis services, a separate account for reporting services, a separate account for integration services. This is to make sure that each service only has the privileges and rights to do what it needs to do. If you use a single account for all your services, then you run the risk of having some services or having an account that has more privileges than it needs and compromising the security of the services. You can always use the Reporting Services Configuration Manager or the SQL Server Configuration Manager to change the service account that a service is using. So if you made a decision on a service account and you later realize you changed your mind, you can always change the security context that a service is running under. You don't have to uninstall and reinstall. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I want to go back to my virtual machine. So here we are. I'm going to close this reporting services web portal, and I don't need these other websites that I showed you earlier, so I'll get rid of them. Keep the environment as simple as possible. I'm going to go to the Start button, and I'm looking for SQL Server Configuration Manager. There's the Configuration Manager. Now, we do not use the SQL Server Configuration Manager to configure the service for reporting services. We use a different tool. If I click on Services, you can see that I see Analysis Services, the Relational Database Engine, Integration Services, the SQL Server Agent. So let's say that I wanted to change the security context that this instance of Analysis Services is using. I can currently see that it says SQL Analysis Services. I can double click on it, and then from right here I can change the user account and password that it's using. It'll take a stop and restart of that service for the change to take effect. When you type your password, make sure you spell the password correctly because it is going to verify the password. Reporting Services uses a different tool. We're going to talk about it a little bit later, but I'll just show you where it is. This one's called Reporting Services Configuration Manager. The Reporting Services Configuration Manager will show you this report server connection. I'll just click on Connect. And this particular tool is solely used for configuring reporting services. We'll talk about it a little bit later. I'm just going to minimize it for now. Come back to it later. Let's continue with the information on page 26. We use the SQL Server Setup Wizard. So there's an executable. We double click on it and it's going to bring up the installation center. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. Let's go ahead and find our file system. Here's our file system. If I go to my C drive and I go to this folder called Software, actually, let's do this inside your training machine. So this is your training machine. I'm going to minimize the SQL Server Configuration Manager. I believe on the C drive of your training machine, we've placed a folder called Software. And you can see that we have SQL 2019. And if I double click on setup.exe, give it a couple of seconds and the SQL Server Installation Center will pop up. This is the same thing that would happen if you took a DVD and put it in your machine. So this is the SQL Server 2019 Installation Center. I showed it to you earlier. And if you haven't browsed this before, I would encourage you to browse it. So it's on your C drive in a subdirectory called software. You can see it's got a planning page, installation, maintenance, tools, resources, advanced, and options. If I want to install something, I go to installation. I mentioned earlier there are links for downloading and installing reporting services, second link down. Third link down, link for downloading and installing the Management Studio, and the fourth one would be for SQL Server Data Tools. If you want to install a brand new instance of, let's say, the relational database engine, or you wanted to add features to an existing installation, you would use the very first link. If you haven't had the opportunity to install SQL Server or play around with the installation, you might want to consider exploring this utility. Reporting services 2017 and 2019 are separate downloads and installs. The installation center that I just showed you has a link that will take you to the Microsoft.com web page where you would download. And after you download it, it'll be in the Downloads folder of the Windows file system, and you simply double click on the downloaded file to start the installation. Some of the things you'll do during the installation: you'll accept the license agreement. The installation will check your prerequisites, for example, checking to see if you have the appropriate .NET framework. If you've never installed SQL before, it's going to ask you, do you want to install the default instance or a named instance? If you've already installed a default instance, the only option is a named instance. Then you come to a feature selection page and you can pick and choose the items that you want. If you're installing SQL Server 2019, you will not see the option for integration. You will not see the option for reporting services. Reporting services, I mentioned earlier, is a separate download. But you'll see the option for integration services. You'll see the option for analysis services. You won't see the option for SQL Server Management Studio. SQL Server Management Studio is also a separate download and install. And after you make your choices, for example, if you choose the option to install the relational database engine, you'll come to another screen and it'll give you the opportunity to specify the user account and password you want the services to run under. Now, you don't have to make any choices there. You can use the default choices that are there. By default, it uses what are called virtual accounts. You can always change the account that's being used at a later time. And if you're not sure what account to use, just accept the defaults and move forward. The one change you might make is changing the start mode to automatic. The SQL Server agent is part of the relational database engine, and the start mode is always set to manual. You can change it to automatic during the installation, or you can use the SQL Server Configuration Manager to change it to automatic at a later time. And there are several more pages during the installation. When you get to the very end, you can verify your choices, then you'll see an install button, and you can install SQL Server. The amount of time that it takes to install is based on the choices that you made. Page 27, additional features. Starting with SQL Server 2014, the SQL Server Data Tools are a separate download and install. You can actually see that right here. We've mentioned that a couple of times. So there's a hyperlink there. The SQL Server Data Tools, starting in 2014, are just a couple of templates that integrate themselves with Visual Studio. Specifically, it's the templates for SQL Server integration services, analysis services, and reporting services. 2016, what it introduced was SQL Server Management Studio as a separate download and install. You can also see that here at 2019. So if I go back to the SQL Server Installation Center, so here's the SQL Server Data Tools, and right above it is the Management Studio. So that's a separate download and install. And right above it, as a reminder, is the reporting services. You can see some links here on the bottom of page 27 that are talking about the separate downloads for reporting services. So if you were to set up your own machine, you'd have to start with the operating system. Then you'd have to download SQL Server and install it. Then you'd have to download and install the Management Studio and install it. You'd have to download Visual Studio and install it. You'd have to download and install reporting services. So it could probably take you several hours to actually set up your training machine, since there's multiple things to download and install. Reporting Services Configuration Manager. We mentioned earlier that Reporting Services has its own utility. And as a reminder, I'll show it to you. So this is the SQL Server Installation Center. Let's close it, and let's close this file system. And I've got the SQL Server Configuration Manager right here, but I want to close it and relaunch it again. I'm just going to go to Start, and I'll just type the letters RE. When I type the letters RE, it's going to find the tools on the machine that best match what you type. There's the Reporting Services Configuration Manager. Since I plan on using it frequently, I'm going to right-click on it, and I can pin it to the Start page. I can also pin it to the taskbar. So now when I pin it to the Start page, when I click on the Start button, there it is. And when I click it to the taskbar, it's this icon right here. Since I plan on using it frequently, I'll just pin it. And when I launch it, it's asking me what server do you want to connect to. I want to connect to the instance called SSRS on a server called Student. And you can see the pages that we have: service account, web service URL, database, web portal URL, email settings, execution account, encryption keys, subscription settings, scale-out deployment, Power BI service. So when I click on service account, you can see the account that it's using the built-in virtual service account. If you want to use a different account, click on the radio button, type in user account and password. Here's the web service URL. When you're first configuring reporting services, you come to report service URL, and you actually will build this. And there's a button called Apply at the very bottom. If you're making changes, you click on it. You can see that URL. So this is the web service URL. Remember, the web service URL is the address that we use to actually deploy content. If I go to the web portal URL, this is the website that humans go to. If I click on it, it'll take me to that website we saw earlier. And I'll close it. If I go to databases, this is where you actually go to manage your existing databases or create new ones. Initially, when you come here, you won't have any databases, and you use this interface to actually create your databases. We configure email settings if you want SQL Server to interact with a mail server. You can go to execution account contacts to specify the security account under which reporting services executes. We go to encryption keys to actually back up the reporting services encryption key, and also to restore it if we need to. We'll talk more about the encryption keys in modules 8 and 9. You can go to subscription settings to see information about subscription settings, specifically configuring a file share. I'll click on Exit. You're going to be playing with this tool in the lab that's coming up shortly. The SQL Server Configuration Manager, not to be confused with the Reporting Services Configuration Manager, is used to actually make changes to the various services. We can change the start mode, we can change the security account. We can also use it to troubleshoot services. If you haven't used this before, let me just very briefly show you what it looks like. I have it pinned down here on the bottom of the screen of the taskbar. I'll just click on it. I opened it earlier. For example, let's say that I wanted to change the start mode on the SQL Server agent. You can see it's set to manual. So I'll double click, and I'll go to Service, and I'll change the start mode to automatic. You can see that I have this instance of the relational database engine, and I'd like to change the security context that it's using. It's currently using a Windows user account called SQL Server. Double click on it, come down here, click on the Browse button, and you can see that we don't have an Active Directory domain, we simply have a Windows server. So I can create Windows user accounts on a local machine and use them. And if I wanted to go and search for a different account, I could come here where the mouse is pointing and type, or click on Advanced, and I can go to Find Now, and I can see all the accounts of the Windows machine. So there's the account for the SQL Server agent. You can see that Windows user account right there is being used to configure this service. The account SQL Server and the account SQL agent, they don't exist by default. Somebody sat down and created them. So there's the SQL Server account, and there's Tina Jones. If I wanted to, I could configure this Windows user account, Tina Jones, to be the security contacts that the relational database engine uses. So if I wanted to do that, I would do something like this. Just double click on Tina Jones, click OK. You can now says that the SQL Server relational database engine is going to be running under the security context of Tina Jones. And all I would do now is I would simply type in the password and confirm the password and click OK. You can see I didn't type in a password. It's just asking me if I want to go ahead and make this change. If I want to make this change, it's going to require a stop and a restart. Do you want to continue? Sure. And it's barking because of the password. I'm just going to click on cancel and leave it the way it was. I can also go to the relational database engine. We have startup parameters. We're not going to look at the startup parameters. But right here it says specify the startup parameter. I can come here and I can use the SQL Server Configuration Manager to actually troubleshoot and solve problems. So if I needed to start SQL Server in single user mode, I would do a -M. If I needed to start SQL Server in minimal configuration mode, I would simply do a -F. If I wanted to start SQL Server with a trace flag, I could simply do a -T and start it with a trace flag. Anything that I type here, don't forget to click on Add to add it to the list of existing parameters. And when you've done what you needed to do, you can come back here and you can remove it. SQL Server Configuration Manager is used by administrators to do a variety of different tasks. That's the end of Module 3. In the next module, we're going to take a look at using the business intelligence development environment, specifically Visual Studio 2019. I will see you